on MeetEcho off our own computers for running the slides.
Exactly. Yeah,
So
they
will
handle
this
it.
actually do anything useful?
It should. Yeah. So the projector right here.
Oh, this is the projector.
Yes.
Okay, never
Uh
mind.
huh.
I wouldn't touch that.
All
I
right.
was thinking slides.
Well, let's try. I don't know. Is it working?
Well, because the slides are running off. Well, they're being shared by MeetEcho, right? So yeah, maybe it would.
Isn't there normally like a little?
I don't know where the dongle for that plugged into.
I don't know. Oh, it's not switched on. That would maybe help, right?
Could be.
I don't know. Huh.
No, we'll just run it.
I'll get that figured out though. Oh my gosh, that's why.
Huh. Well, I don't have a USB-C plug on my computer.
No, those
Is
are all
that
H.
I got a USB. Wait,
I think that's
here we go.
H.
No, no, that's not right.
Nope. Okay. Okay. Well, I
Oh
will.
wait, that says not a USB. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I don't actually have a USB-A plug anymore.
Oh yeah, because you need the little
That's okay. We can
docking. Okay, I'll
we
see
can
if
do
I
it
can
the
get one
old-fashioned
up
way.
here.
Oh, it turned my thing on. Sound muted. And, I think we need to run the full version of MeetEcho to run the queue and everything. See everything that's going on, which means I have to make sure I got my audio off.
Okay, are you set?
I think I'm set. I can run the slides. You gotta tell people about that when that comes up.
Could we go ahead and get started, please? Wow, this is the smallest turnout ever.
It's all old timers mostly.
Where's John?
He's here. He was just here. He's not far. That's in the back, isn't it? No.
No. Oh, he's with his back to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
You want to talk about me drive?
I can. Okay, welcome to the STIR session at IETF 115. Next slide. This is the note well. I think everybody probably knows about it, but please, if this is new to you, please review it before you contribute. Thank you. Next. Please pay attention to the IETF Code of Conduct, basically treating each other with respect and courtesy. Thank you. So the meeting tips, please make sure when you want into the queue, you use the MeetEcho app to get in line. And please, if you're in the room when you're not speaking to a microphone, wear your mask. Thank you.
And please log into MeetEcho Lite, even if you're not in line, because that's how we do the blue sheets now.
Indeed, thank you. Okay, so this is the document status. Basically, a whole bunch of these documents are moving along pretty rapidly. We just saw the 3 documents in this first category appear on the ISG mail agenda for the 1st of December. So they're moving along quickly. The ones here in group 2 are the provider OOB. We've been waiting for an update to this. We agreed that once dash 03 was posted, we'd do a working group last call, but we haven't seen 03 since April.
We have.
It just happened. All right, then we will start that.
Last week, I think.
Okay, so complete shift in the last day to about who's got the token. And OCSP, new draft on stapling. The question is this ready for adoption? We'll be talking about that today.
2 pages on the agenda.
So there's the agenda is we'll be going through, I believe these first 3 documents will be very quick in terms of, since they were just all updated, some status information, but they're on the ISG agenda as we said. Next slide. And then the ones that are basically in work. And so we have ones that we're trying to decide whether we should adopt or just move forward or where we are on those. Are there any agenda bashes? Okay. Then let's start with the status of those 3 documents that are on the ISG agenda. Is there anything for us to talk about? Yep, Chris.
Already sent it for RCD.
So next slide. We can talk about these. I just tried to use this as an opportunity to go through all the diffs that have happened over the various reviews. There is a few minor normative things, as I note on the 5th bullet item. I can quickly go through them if you prefer. So first one, I clarified some of the rules of inclusion of URI references. Really, it's only for JCD and JCL keys. I did include normative language as was suggested with the review comments. I moved the clarification of using double quoted strings, which was explicitly noted in the name and APN section, to the parent section, because it really applies more generally to how we calculate digest for strings more generally. So that was also based on a comment. As Jack pointed out on the mailing list, some of the examples had the wrong double quotes, which was causing issues when generating the digest. So did fix that, which was a good catch. This was a somewhat major organizational change, but not changing meaning. So I prefaced each of these sections approaching it from mode 3 and mode 4, where you were using RCD claims and RCDI claims for details on using claims constraints. I changed that, I think, to be less confusing, where the first section is specific to the usage of claim constraints for RCD specifically, and then the second section adds when you use RCDI with RCD. So hopefully that makes sense. There was a minor normative suggestion there I literally capitalized the most and mays in those sentences. So hopefully that doesn't change much there. There was some confusion over compact form, as there generally is for most documents. So I added a little more background and pointers to definitions and sections in documents that were relevant for that. The further information associated with callers, it was sort of in an awkward place in the document, sort of like in the middle, even though it talks about future things and those types of things. So I actually moved it to the last section. Just I didn't alter it, I just moved it essentially. Next page. So for the SIP specific sections, we have verification and authentication procedures sections that are general to RCD passport usage. And then we had sections that are specific to SIP authentication service and verification. So there was some overlaps in some of the descriptions there, so I tried to clean that up. And I took 2 paragraphs that were in the SIP specific sections and made a new section called verification using third-party RCD to remove those from the SIP specific sections, and then cleaned up the SIP specific sections to refer essentially to like rules about what you do, comparisons with SIP header fields and things like that, and compact form, etc. And then finally, in the IANA request, I labeled the IANA registry as passport RCD types. There was a comment about what does types mean. So my simple fix for that was actually to make it more specific to passport RCD claim types, which hopefully clarifies that. Types is a word that we use in other registries already as well, so I didn't think that was too much of an issue, but I think I did realize RCD claim was a better clarification for that specific registry. And that's all that I could find that was major. Everything else was mostly editorial.
Any questions about any of these changes? Okay.
I'm actually in queue. So pretend I'm from the floor. This is Ben. The one question I have, and I know the answer to this, but I just wanted to make sure we mentioned it explicitly. There was some commentary over coming up with some explicit way to tag for RCDI when you were looking at hashing the field itself versus dereferencing the field for the hash. And I think the answer is we're not going to act on that, right? That was in the art.
Dereference. Say that.
So there was a comment. I can't think of his name.
Martin.
No. No, it was the art review.
I think it was on your first slide,
It was?
the top one, wasn't it?
Okay, hang on.
Yeah. Yeah, the URI
Okay.
reference recursion rules for JCD and JCL.
But the idea of putting in any kind of actual syntactic sugar to say this is a reference versus a.
Oh, yeah.
We're not
suggestion.
acting on that point, right?
Oh,
Yeah, the
very
potential suggestion of adding another slash or something. Yeah, I tried to clarify that in the document and in my response to the review comment, which is, there's only one potential. JCL is the only one that does 2 URI references. Everything else is a single URI reference.
Or we can only have one level of recursion. I don't know,
Right, exactly.
Okay.
I mean, this has been sticky in RCD for a long time, and I mean, I think I personally felt like we never got closure on the threat model that we were actually trying to beat with some of this, but I'm willing to gloss over this at this point because honestly, I think it is so complicated, no one will ever use it. And this text will be inert in the document.
Are you proposing we change anything?
No, I said I'm willing to let this slide. I mean, I read the comment. I'm like, okay, we can put some things in here that like try to, but I think it's it's a pointless exercise because I think this is so complicated that no one will ever use it.
So I think we've seen here there's a number of minor, primarily clarification and organizational type changes. Some of them are a little bit normative, and I don't see anyone jumping up objecting to any of them. Remember, this is on the telechat for December 1st. And if we haven't seen any objections, in the next few days to this, we're going to assume that everyone's happy with it.
Yeah, I'm just saying, I'm really looking forward to what Roman has to say about this. Because, I mean, we may be forced to clarify what the threat model is at that point, what we actually think this accomplishes.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting telechat, and there's going to be education on both sides. Okay. Oh, I gotta get back.
The next one.
So, get unshare that and stop it. Share again. What's next? Identity header.
Either one.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, this one is much simpler. Next slide. So a couple of the changes, actually, there's been a lot of revisions, but some of them are just very incremental revisions. So again, got some comments about the introduction and providing more, background on the STIR problem and definitions of AS and VS. So I included much more background there and pointer to RFCs and things like that. The one thing we already talked about, but I wanted to explicitly include, we talked about it on the list, but I wanted to explicitly include it here, was clarifying the statement that we added around provisional SIP response message, or that it's the or final response message that I think was the discussion point. That was based on comments that we got from 3GPP actually. So just added that. It was actually to make it more consistent with a different section in the document. So not really a change there, but just wanted to mention it. Murray suggested changing shoulds to must. I think the reason that it was shoulds is because we weren't sure if this was something people would adopt or not, but I think for the purpose of this document, must is appropriate. So I'd probably, if out of all the changes, that's probably the one to maybe note the most. Yeah, I got a comment about clarifying that you should only have a single reason header corresponding to a single error. I think that's pretty straightforward. Clarifying using STIR cause codes only for STIR defined errors, which again is what we intended. And then the other changes were editorial. So I don't know if there's any discussion on should versus must, which I think is probably the only one thing that is of note in the changes. Otherwise, I think it's pretty good. All right.
So I think the next thing we had to do on agenda was messages, and we don't have the slides for that. Is there anything to say about it?
Nope. So last call completed. There were all the art reviews are late except for art actually came in. That was from Claude and Claudio. It was fine. There's nothing. There's non-blocking MIDI stuff. So I mean, when the other reviews come in, there may be other issues, but it looks to me from what we've seen so far from last call that it's clean.
And if I recall the last call, what we had is just strictly editorial, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So again, on the telechat for December 1st, we might get some reviews that drop late, which could change things, but probably not. So what's next? So the next would be connected identity. Let me find the slides.
Okay, the mask needs to come off of this one. Because I'm going to be taking you on a little bit of a rabbit hole, of a wild ride here. So be prepared. Right, so where did this start with? So way back in the day, after RFC 4474 was released, a guy by the name of John Elwell, who worked for Siemens then, got a bee in his bonnet. We had to solve this problem of connected identity. And partly this is because, the way that 4474 was originally designed, the identity header could only be used in requests. Some very good reasons for that, and I'm going to talk about some of those good reasons in a moment. So he wrote this draft that introduced a new option tag that's called from change. It would be used in concert with 100 rel, and it would allow the terminating side through this complex mechanism with pracs and updates and like all these different things, be able to say the party you ended up reaching when you formed this session, when you sent this invite, was somebody different than you expected. And now all future mid-dialogue or dialogue terminating requests, when they have a from header field in them, it will reflect who that new target is. Cool idea. Of course, then we completely redid everything that 4474 discussed, and it's been clear to us, we've had an action item for some time. In part, I think this is mostly inspired by the SIP Brandy effort, which is an attempt to figure out a way to build a full security stack with media encryption up from what we've built from STIR, which is a very laudable goal. Stephen Farrell certainly thought it was a laudable enough goal that he dictated that we go do this, and me and Russ and Richard Barnes and a bunch of other people got stuck with that task, if I recall. But there are also a bunch of practical attacks that can surface, unfortunately, if the only thing you sign is an invite, is a dialogue forming request. And some examples of this, like in the mobile space, there are these call stretching attacks where you have two terminating sides agree you have a session, and there's some intermediary though who isn't behaving very well, who decides to kind of forge a buy in one direction in order to convince one side of the call that it terminated earlier than the other side of the call, so that for very high rate calls, you can kind of collect an extra second or two, maybe in the middle there, as you're the transit network for it. And I'm going to lose my monitor here. And this is something it would be great to be able to beat, right? An untrusted transit network who is exploiting this over wide variety. People do this for every call, right? In some of these terrible transit network fraud cases, and each one may only give you a little bit, but if you're processing millions of calls over months and months and months, it all adds up, and you can actually make quite a bit of fraudulent money from it. I'm also concerned about some of these route hijacking attacks. These are attacks where, because routing of voice over IP calls is not always based on authoritative or public databases, but instead on forwarding tables on flat files that reside in various networks, you never really know for some of these IP calls if you're actually reaching the party you intended to reach. Okay, now this was never in the original RFC 7375 threat model for SIP, or for STIR. And we had to do some work to figure out how to get the charter fixed for that. The charter is now fixed for that. So next slide. Right. Is this like a touch screen where I push it?
I don't know. I just asked Mideko if they, nope.
No.
The monitor saying it's about to shut down for lack of
Yes,
activity because
yes,
you're
it
not
is.
moving around enough or something.
Maybe we stop. Is this thing doing it?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I'll probably just advance the slide. Why don't you advance the slide? We'll see if we can work through this issue. Okay. Is this the next slide or is this the slide after?
That's weird.
Okay, well, I think we can go with this as the next slide. I'm going to pretend this is the next slide. We're going to go with it.
Up there.
Okay.
No? Okay,
No.
so next slide. Yeah. Okay, this is the next slide. Good enough for me. Okay, so there's a new version that I just put out, and this contains a bunch of stuff that John made up. This is very different from what John Olwell originally put in RFC 4916. It's a significant departure, and it's based on the notion, why don't we just let there be identity headers in responses, in provisional and final responses? And so at a high level, this is a major revision that says, let's pivot to this as the main way we imagine that Connect Identity could work for STIR. It introduces a new passport type that we call RSP. This can only appear in responses. It has some rules for interaction with diversion that are interesting, that are based on some things I added to the diversion spec very late in its development for cases where you might want to be able to reflect diversion headers back to the called party in cases where you're dealing with redirection. In other words, where if you have a call and it's being processed and it hits a redirect server and it sends back a 302, you want to be able to collect the divs that existed to date before you then create a new request and embed those divs in it. It was actually this div reflection thing that gave me the idea for doing this in the first place, and the general practice in div of signing the dest of the passport rather than the orig of the passport. The moving pieces of that have come together into this RSP concept. But I will say I did not pull all of the 4916 from change mechanism out of this. This is still in there, and we may still need it, and that's something I want to talk about today, whether we still need it or not. I hope we don't, but let's go through it. So next slide, please. So yeah, what RSP does, as I said, it's basically a passport that is signed the way that div is. You assume that a call has reached a terminating party. The terminating party may or may not, at this point, be the same person that you originally intended to be the destination for the call. Diversion could have happened. So either way, though, you're going to take a new passport, you're going to sign, that's going to be populated just like the original passport was, with the same orig, dest, and so on. You're going to then sign that with a credential that is responsible for the telephone number that appears in the dest field of this. And you're going to be able to embed this in responses you send in the backwards direction. And in the sunny day case where there's no diversion, this actually sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Right? Like, I mean, okay, you get a request in, it is signed. You say, great, I'm going to make a passport. It looks just like the passport I just saw. We're going to instead sign for it with my credential instead of the credential that originally signed for the passport. Ship it out in a 1AX or in a 200. And like for the basic SIP brandy use case where what you want is protection for M key, that is for the media keys. There's this little field that lets you have the fingerprints that will appear in the media keys in SDP for like DTLS, SHTP or whatever. Okay, this is now dead. I may be turning my head a little bit as I do this. I think this is basically good enough for that in the sunny day case. Like this will enable both sides to have cryptographic protection for that M key and to be able to ascertain, yeah, the right people roughly were signing for this. Simplicity itself, right? We're done. Okay, next slide. We're going to get into a couple of caveats, and these are the reasons why we didn't do this in the first place. And I have distant memories of me castigating John Elwell when he was standing where I am now, and I was at the mic, and I was telling him why things like this that are so simple aren't going to work. And so sure, we all know that provisional responses are not necessarily reliable, and there are all kinds of cases where forking proxies may be collecting them, and they'll never actually end up getting back to the original UAS, let alone the original authentication service or the verification service on the originating side. I can kind of live with that. Like sometimes this is going to work, sometimes it's not. By the time there's a final response, the 200 OK has, the proper passport embedded in its identity header, that'll be authoritative for the call. Real problems are in the second thing there. The second thing there is where all the problems start. You can't reject SIP responses. You can challenge SIP requests. You can send 401s and 407s. You can use all kinds of fancy error codes we've defined specifically for STIR to be able to explain, here is a repairable condition you could fix. Like, I don't support your trust anchor, or I looked at this passport and it's malformed. There's all these things you can kind of communicate back as feedback that it would be really nice to have. I mean, honestly, just being able to challenge would be really nice to have, right? I mean, our assumption in STIR is that if I send an invite up to an authentication service and the authentication service, doesn't know who I am, needs to challenge me with digest or something. Oh, I get it. You're JDR, you're JDR.net, fantastic. Now I know I can sign for you on your behalf. That part is, it's hard to miss, but you can imagine in a lot of cases, there are reasons why that request got forwarded to the ultimate endpoint that is responding, that this is all coming from. There are location services and so on that are, pretty much can figure out, is the entity that is sending this response in the backwards direction the right entity without having to rely on digest to do it. I'm pretty confident that stuff works. Another small issue in this is, of course, that the AS needs to be in the reverse path of the transaction. So, okay, you'd need to assume kind of as this is going through the terminating network, maybe the VS adds a VIA that will be for the AS as it goes by. And, In practice, though, the real reason why I just don't care anymore is because in reality, all the SIP detail about how VIAs and all these other things work is kind of immaterial to the way that this mostly works in the field for Stir Shake It. How does this actually work? There's an SBC. It sits on the edge of the network. All of your traffic goes in and out of that thing, right? And that thing just has an API that actually talks to an AS and a VS over HTTPS, right? And like, having the lift of telling that thing, okay, when requests go through, you're doing a VS thing, responses come in the backwards direction, just send them up to the AS and get an identity signature from it, right? Like, so I think not everything works that way. There are SIP-like services that require this thing where the AS actually adds a VIA, the VS adds a VIA to make sure that this will go in the backwards direction through the AS. But practically speaking, like most of the way Stir Shaken is working today in the world, you're just going through your PCSCF or your some SBC function that's going to see this anyway. So I'm not super worried about that anymore. If you do want to be able to reject identities in the backwards direction, I think you need all that from change stuff, all those updates, all the things that are in RFC 4916. It's really, really clunky. And I just think it's too complicated for people to implement, which is what motivated me to look for something simpler that was actually just going to get the job done based on what the 80% of the time case is. And that's where we're going with this. Next slide. Div is another interesting wrinkle in this. So the sunny day case where, okay, I was trying to call Fidelity Investments and great, I ended up reaching Fidelity Investments. That's what's come back in connected identity. That looks great, I think, with what we've stipulated so far. Cases where, well, I'm like trying to reach Cullen, but like it actually turns out that, Yuri is the one that is responding and it's Yuri's connected identity that is coming back in this 183 response or 400K response. Like that's a little messier. But building on what we implemented in div for redirection cases, my proposal is you collect the div headers that resulted in this call going to Erie anytime the target changed sufficiently within the canonicalization definitions of 8224 that a new target needed to be signed and a div is generated. Let's just take that set of divs with the RSP passport and ship them all in the backwards direction. And in fact, there's some language in there now that's the second major bullet there that says that if you have a desk that you're going to put in RSP, and it's not the desk, the original passport that was forming this dialogue with an invite, you must not send it unless you send at least one div in a separate identity header along with it. And this was actually a major weakness of 4916 when I look at it in retrospect, because John Elwell was really concerned with making sure you know who it was you ended up connecting to. What div gives you is cryptographic assurance of that is the right person you should have connected to. And this isn't always going to work. Like not everybody does divs. There's a surprising amount of divs that I actually see in production traffic at this point, now that we have enough production traffic that we can ascertain what's actually out there. But sometimes connected identity isn't going to work. And that's okay. Like sometimes it's not going to be possible. It's for the cases like SIP Brandy where there's criticality around it and you'd really want to tear down the session effectively. If I was trying to connect to someone and I want to have a secure media connection for it to be encrypted and so on, if this stuff doesn't work, you want to just throw the entire session out the window. That's okay. Like as long as it doesn't result in a security failure, as long as there's not a case where I think I've connected to the right person and I have media security and it's working and I get whatever, a lockbox or something in my UI. As long as I'm not putting something in there that can permit that to happen, I think this is sufficient to address the SIP Brandy case. And I'm interested in Russ's thoughts about that. But I mean, I think there may be one or two more slides. I mean, yeah, but before we get to this and talk about the cases for from change, any thoughts? What do you guys think about this? Helping, hurting?
Figured out how to get online.
And again, the high level bullet here is I want a way to do this that is not going to involve all the cruft that was in 4916 that I think can actually work for a good chunk of the practical deployment use cases for this.
Jonathan's in line.
All right. So Jonathan Rosenberg, 5'9". On the mechanism change, I mean, I didn't even remember this 4916 thing. I don't think, does anyone, I mean, like, to my
No one has
knowledge,
ever
this
built
never
it.
got implemented,
It's so
right?
clunky, like nobody built it.
I don't even, thinking about it, I don't even think it would really work. There are still probably race conditions and all kinds of stuff. So I don't think backward compatibility or support for that is relevant in any way. And I certainly agree with your assessment that practically speaking, the vast majority of SIP is over TCP. A lot of these issues about reliability are not that relevant anymore. And anyway, the 2XX is really all that matters. The forking stuff, where that's also nonsense, never got implemented really. When it's all B2B ways, it's a single two. So I think this is going to work from a mechanics perspective. So I'm good with that. And I would remove all of just get rid of all the cruft. So
All
you
this
said you
from-
didn't.
all the from change.
Yeah,
Let-
yeah, yeah.
Let me make the case for from change in a minute, because I do want to make the case.
Okay.
But like, of the simplified mechanism, yeah, what do
Yeah.
you think the bogeys are?
I think the big problem you're going to have with this is the same problem we had with independent of the protocol mechanism, is that there's no way to make a useful decision about what you should do when it doesn't match. And it isn't going to match all the time.
Yep.
Like probably more often it won't match than it will match, given the vagaries of the mess of call routing that is the public switch telephone network. And so what is one to do? And the answer is there's no way to differentiate a legitimate mismatch versus a non-legitimate mismatch from the sequence of divs or the connected identity. And so no way to even inform the user to allow them to, like, I can't construct a user experience that will be useful to users that will just make them ignore it.
So
That's my big, it'll just
yeah.
be useless. That's
So
my big.
I do have a
feedback.
pitch about this, and I have this in another slide. I think the pitch is that we establish a criticality mechanism for it for those cases where users demand criticality. In other words, like for SIP branding, great example. If like my only interest is having this is an intergovernmental thing, but where the FBI is calling the CIA about something, and like if they would push the criticality button for this and say, for these calls, if this doesn't work, don't set up the session. And you might even want that for some banking, healthcare, kinds of applications as well. So just imagine a UI thing where you have that ability of criticality to say, like, I don't want you to set up the session if this doesn't work.
I mean, even in these banking cases, given all the different ways calls get transferred around, like they're not going to match all the time, and it's still your bank. That's the problem. And humans rely on other things in the natural conversation to make the determination about whether the call is successfully routed. Now, of course, there are cases of some malicious guy stealing calls, trying to fake out fidelity and blah blah blah, and like, I don't think this is going to fix that. That's my main comment.
I think it's going to be able to tell you absolutely, certainly when it worked.
That's
And
true.
it doesn't fix it, but this is my whole point to Russ.
Correct.
Like it's going to tell you when you got it right,
Right.
and give you that confidence in those cases. And on the cases where you don't have it, maybe that's when some kind of knowledge-based authentication, or like, think about it this way: if Fidelity is calling you, and they want to decide how much KVA they need to do when they reach whoever it is that picks up the phone.
Yeah.
Like these are cases that I think it might have some applicability to.
Yeah, I don't think it's useless enough that I'm going to say we shouldn't do it. Obviously, it's been adopted as a working group item. I'm just like, I'm not sure it'll get that much use. It's on my like, hey, as an implementer, which I am, like, would I do this? I would not. I don't think it's going to really work generally for the contact center. And then it depends on a massive deployment of UI and client changes and AS changes that, so.
Well, also think in the back of the mind, thinking about these like mobile operator use cases associated with the GSMA, where I think
Yeah.
there are possibilities that there will be a whole separate thing this is being airlifted on top of, in which case those do address some very particular, like that call stretching thing I was talking about, attacks that people are losing enough money on
Right.
that it's worth it for them to do something.
Yeah. Okay.
Jonathan Lennox, on the question of having a div if you put a response doesn't match. Just addressing this from a very sort of abstract user experience. If I, try to call Cullen and I get something that says, no, I try to call Cullen's phone, I get a thing that says, no, you reached Jonathan's phone, and I have a cryptographic assurance this is Jonathan's phone. I don't see why it makes a difference to me whether I have cryptographic assurance of somebody else's phone network thought I should have reached Jonathan's phone versus I reached Jonathan's phone for some reason I don't know. Why do I care about that difference?
So I think you care for the set of use cases where you have no idea what it was you ended up connecting to or why, right? I mean, what does div really tell you? Div tells you you called Fidelity, and Fidelity said you should instead be connected to this phone number of this like work at home agent, right?
So the
And
point
like
being
if
that,
you just got something from work at home agent saying like, hey, I'm Fidelity, like
so
that,
the point is
there's
that
no
the div
reason.
says this is Cullen authorized that I reach Jonathan, as opposed to just
Yes.
some random phone network authorized I reach Jonathan.
And it, again, I think it becomes clearer when you look at I'm trying to reach Fidelity, and instead
Yeah, okay,
this
yeah,
is this
that's
work from
fair,
home
yeah,
call agent
yeah.
that I reached that is just a random number in Omaha, right?
Yeah, okay, I guess so. Yeah, I guess that makes some sense.
Chris went. So +1 on the cleanup, I think it was very much needed, and I like the path forward. I also wanted to bring up, I think this sort of puts us in a good position from messaging and presence use cases as a path forward. So
Always in the back of my mind because
I
there's a lot
want
of connect identity stuff and messaging.
people to be thinking about that as well.
Ben Campbell, pretending to be on the floor. I just wanted to refer back to the comment about, everyone's TCP these days. In fact, I hear from some of the US carriers that a lot of their interconnects are still UDP and still have fragmentation problems. But honestly, this is the least of their problems if that's the case. Yeah, well, they're getting around that too, and it'll be really interesting to see how they want to do all of this out of bounds for that case. But anyway, I don't think we can worry about that because they can't even make the basic STIR cases work, much less this.
You're going to see a slide about that in a moment.
It's just going to say I like this. And I sort of jumped up when Jonathan said that like the majority of cases this might not work. I don't think I really agree on that. I think the vast majority of cases I actually care about this has a high degree of working on, and it's going to be call center cases where it fails, which mostly I don't want those calls anyway, so it doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
And but so like outbound calling to call centers, this really helps, right? Like the bank calling me individually, they can check I answered my phone. So it helps that sort of case. So any cases where the destination is
it's
not a call center, this has a high degree of helping.
You were shaking your head. This is the TFA case for messaging in a nutshell, right? Like the bank is trying to send a message to you, and if that is getting hijacked, like due to SIM swap or whatever, is the person that got swim swaps to actually responsible?
This is not going to be close to good enough. They're going to rely on all kinds of other stuff.
No, so whatever. I'm not sure I agree with Jonathan on this. I mean, I think we agree on that we both agree on this is a good thing. But I think, and the other thing too is like the banking cases in particular, no, that's exactly the people, they're just going to go make all this stuff work. Like if it doesn't work in their call centers, they're going to get call center equipment that does work for it. They really are. It's too important for them. So I think that even for incoming calls to bank call centers, this is going to work just fine because they will go make it work. But others won't. So I just want to, on individual to individual calling or company to company or B2B calling, the vast majority of calling where you care about this stuff, it probably will work. I think it's going to be a very high success rate. So I like the idea.
I mean, it is because so much of this really is just SBCs or edge elements and networks that are requiring both, all legs of the call to hairpin through them at all times. And it's really not much of a change to their APIs to just be able to go get these things signed. That's what gives me confidence that practically, if we convince people to do this, like it will not be a heavy lift for those networks to just start having identity pairing responses.
Yeah, code's already written, it's already one way. And I think that the vast majority of cases I care about deeply are the sunny day case. There's no div, there's no anything. Right?
Yeah, I mean, the div case is it's going to be touch and go, man. I mean, I don't know how much we're going to get that to work, but I want a story for how it could work. But sunny day cases are like 90% of the cases, and in most banks may not even care if there's a div how good our cryptography is, right? They want that to be the sunny day case, or they're not going to be confident in who you are. Okay, so is there anybody here who maybe I should do the case for from change before I pose this question? So let me do this, and how we're okay in time, right?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So what really is the sunny day case? And this is going back, or the from change case, sorry. This is going back to what was in 4916 originally. So a new option tag was specified in 4916, And this was still at a time, by the way, where there was some residual confusion about what it meant to change the from and to header field values in SIP requests. Back in like RFC 2543, which I don't see too many people in this room to blame for that other than Dr. Rosenberg. Oh, Jonathan, you were there too. That's true. Back when transaction matching was actually done with the values of from and to before we moved this all to tags, right? That was still something that unfortunately there was a lot of implementation of that still out there at the time that John Elwell started working on what was 4916. Now that was at least 20 years ago. I believe the 20th anniversary of SIP is upon us, that it became the law of the land that you're instead doing this matching of the tags that are hanging off the from and to header field values. And so as a consequence of that, you know, the way that from change, we look at it, I think can be different in a couple of respects. One of the main ones is actually in a sub-bullet there. A lot of people actually sign this P asserted identity field from RFC 3325 instead of the from and to. And indeed, nothing about the identity to anybody who operates that way has anything to do with what's in the from header fields at all, which is one of the reasons why when we look at this in from change, I'm a little skeptical about what the value of it is. But I will say this, you do get that you can challenge, right, the connected identity. If you force this to come in an update message, like it is possible for you to send 401s and 407s and validate the proper users behind them in this instances. In some of the mid-call cases where there's like transfer or something, and so you want to send an update to say, hey, there's actually a new identity on the other side of this. Like there's reasons why you might want to have something like from change work in those instances. But at the end of the day, if the problem is that when you're signing a buy, your orig does not match the from header field, and you're signing a buy in the backwards direction in a dialog terminating request, I guess my question is, so what, right? If we assume, because I guess I'd put it this way, the subtext under everything I'm proposing here is that previously STIR-shaken is pretty stateless, right? You send an invite, it's got a passport in it, and like somebody checks that and validates that before they make a decision about how they're going to treat the call, and then you forget about STIR-shaken entirely. Bringing this into a context where there's connected identity, where it matters, identity does in responses and mid-dialogue and dialogue terminating requests, it starts to bring in an assumption that there is some state that is going to be maintained, right, about who the connected parties are on the call that have been cryptographically verified. And that, you know, that does reflect a different philosophy, at least one we have not explored to date on this. And so I don't want to sweep it under the rug, but I guess I'm just not that concerned. If somebody signs a buy and the orig does not match your from header field in that buy, I'm not that worried, because in a lot of places, P asserted identity is actually what you're signing rather than the from in the first place, and it doesn't have to have any resemblance to the from. So I think there are significant deployments where that is a non-issue. But that's the case for why we keep it. The two bullets at the top are, can I get a sense from the room? I think I already heard Jonathan, everybody else. Do we want to keep the from change stuff in this document? We could kick it to another doc too, for this like special case where you actually care about this stuff, and then have like this document be the place where we do connected identity the way we think is simplest and will work for the Sunday day cases. Show of hands, who wants us to keep the 4916 from change mechanism, which involves pracs and updates and all these things happening before you reach a dialogue forming?
We want the tool.
We did.
Oh, we do have a tool.
Yeah, we have a show of hands tool.
Show of hands. While that's running, I'm gonna get some more water.
What's the question?
You want to keep the old
Keep.
cars.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So the question is, do we want to fix the 4916 mechanism? There's still work I'd need to do that, mind you, right? Like there's like examples and stuff that would need to be reformulated that don't use the old identity info header anymore and things like that. Like it's like actual work, which is why I'd rather pose the question before I do that, like actual work.
So I said that we want to fix the mechanism for from change. Is that good enough?
Well, in this document, do we want to keep the from change mechanism of 4916 in this document?
Can I talk
Go
before
ahead, Chris.
So I'm just this is Chris Went. I'm curious, is it relevant that John talked about P-asserted ID? That's typically associated with personal handsets. Is it relevant that the use cases we're talking about, the security is associated with folks that generally don't use P-asserted ID, and that's a separate use case? And I don't know, just thought I'd bring that up. That's the thought that came to my head. And, um, you know, I'm sort of thinking that having this as a separate mechanism that we attack once we understand the problem better is a better idea. But a couple of thoughts there.
Yeah, I'm not seeing a lot of support for keeping the from change in here. I mean, honestly, when I really looked at this, I mean, I just don't think anybody will build it. I don't. It's too complicated. It's always been too complicated. And okay.
So we saw for the minutes, we saw 6 people who actively didn't raise their hand. And I assume everyone else didn't raise their hand either, but they didn't check a box to say that.
Okay, next slide.
Not this doc.
Yeah, I may fix that, but that's going to end up on the back burner. You know, I've got a stove with, like, you know, there's front burner, the second burner, third burner. Then there's like a hot plate in my basement. Like, you know. Anyway, next slide, please. So yeah, that was my question. Is this a good direction? If so, there's a lot to do, right? I sketched some stuff in this document. There may be some fancier ways that we can figure out to get the AS in the path, other than just having the VS add a via as this goes in, that we can look at that. I am kind of interested in what new route hijacking attacks would look like against this. In other words, assume that this is the law of the land. How would I synthesize divs and then REST passports to make people think that they reached the right thing? And I think there's a whole vector of those that I'd like to look at that I think we need serious security considerations to be able to discuss. This option tag for criticality of connected identity, I think that this answers part of the question of what the user experience around this needs to be. There's already some text in there that actually talks about the existence of, like, directories that you can imagine people would publish. You should get connected identity from me. Like, Fidelity Investments could have some place, and this is starting to get into DMARC-ish territory, where you're like, you know, if you don't get connected identity from me, there's a problem, and, like, you should not do this. Does anybody actually do paid in responses today? P-asserted identity? Chris, do you know, or anybody else? I'm not sure I've seen paid in responses. But if we're doing this thing, you know, we're not going to do from change, but we'll have a paid that reflects, you know, what the actual identity sending it is. We might also, as we do this, update 3325. We'll leave that to Colin as one of the co-authors of 3325.
Bottom of my list.
Bottom of my list. I also, when I was mulling this over before I submitted it, I was like, should we be using opt for this? And for those of you that don't know, opt is something that we created for diversion initially. That was a way that you could embed a passport in another passport. And I looked a bit at the value of, okay, do we want the original passport that is being received on the terminating side to be embedded in the REST passport that would be sent backwards? So you have the original signature and you have a correlation function that's more direct. From my original mull of that, I couldn't figure out a threat that beat. It seemed like the kind of thing there must be a threat that could beat, but then I couldn't really think of anything. But I think we might want to talk about it. So in other words, there's a laundry list of stuff like this I think we'd still need to figure out if we want to go in this direction. It sounds like we're going to say, let's not have 4916 from change in scope, because that will save me the trouble of building those examples and, oh my God, everything else associated with that.
Is there anyone we might rope into doing a little bit of formal analysis of the security properties of all of this?
Yeah, I would love if some academic could get some funding to do said security analysis of this. This is basically mostly what Chris Went and I, agree over Google Chat is a good idea at like 6 in the morning some days, is how this gets cobbled together. Next slide. All right, so obviously we are not going to go for working group last call or anything like that at the moment, but I think I'm taking away from this permission to go make this real. I mean, I actually did put in quite a bit of text about it already, but there's just a lot that is going to need to be done and cleaned up and thought through to get it there. But this has been sitting around forever, like without any appreciable work on it. And I feel like we need it for a number of use cases that I'm now aware are out there, including messaging and including some other things. And as I said, the mobile operator space. And so I guess I'll get to work.
So from the chair perspective, just wanting to be explicit here, this is an update to what was already a working group document. It's a substantial change from it. I have not heard anyone complain that we need to go through the adoption process with this again, so I'm going to assume that we don't. If anyone wants to complain about that, do it now or hold your peace. Okay.
Okay. What's next? Am I still here?
What's next? What was that? That was condition identity out of band.
Yeah, I have like one slide about out of band. I think we can have this discussion very simply. There exists a service provider out of band draft. I'm not aware of anything that needs to be done for it in order for it to advance. This is something that is, it builds on 8816, 8916, 8816, which is the original out of band framework and architecture that generally outline ways that you could share passports when for whatever reason, SIP was not available. Of course, the way that out of band originally looked at this, we imagined there should be this like big internet-wide service, the CPS, and the CPS was untrusted by like both the originating and terminating network. And, they needed a way to be able to push passports up to the CPS from the originating side that could be available to the terminating side while revealing as little information as possible to the CPS about who the parties were to the communication. The facilitating assumption of the service provider OOB draft is that instead, there's a little CPS, call placement service, that's kind of attached to the terminating network. In other words, any calls that it can see are calls that are going to that network anyway, and it's not going to reveal anything to anybody because it at least logically lives in the terminating side network. And this allows us to significantly relax some of the very onerous security constraints and mechanisms that we use to manage out of band in the original 8816. And this is, frankly, it is descriptive. This is not prescriptive. This is descriptive of emerging things that are being used in the enterprise space for STIR-shaken, I would say, fairly widely at the moment. Ways that enterprises are able to get these tokens put into places where terminating networks can use them to make sure that, in particular, enterprises actually place the calls that are showing up in terminating networks. It is kind of an end run, I would say, around a known deficiency, well, I'll say a known vulnerability of the way that shaken attestation works and the way that calls enter the IP NNI. And do you have a question already about this, Ben?
I was just going to add on to that Addis has been building heavily on this. I don't know if they referenced this or the base draft, but very similarly for getting around non-IP interconnects.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I think the distinctions between the way that we approach this and Addis has are, I guess I'll say, threefold. I mean, I think the Addis use case is really primarily concerned about, there's an IP NNI and it's fast and carriers are connected to it. And then there's like these little satellites of like TDM that exist on the periphery of this. And it's looking at how to build an adapter, right, for those particular use cases to allow those TDM providers to still get passports signed and get them out into the IP NNI. it has a security model that rather than having the CPS be like logically located in a terminating service providers network, instead there is a federation, a global federation, or at least a national IP and NNI-wide federation of CPSs, which are required to share state with each other. In other words, any passport that is going to be pushed to any CPS has to be broadcast to all of the CPSs in order for this to work. And that is
They
from-
expect it to be a very small number of these.
from an, but the issue is that there is a, and I don't want to speak to the commercial realities of this here in the IETF. And really, I should be characterizing like Addis's proposals in the IETF. This is a little dirty pool for me. But you know, the reality is that I think there are great disparities between the number of calls and passports that are processed by the different entities that are participating in the potential CPS infrastructure for this. And, you know, as with any peering arrangement, if one of these providers has 100x as many passports as the other one does, and there are privacy and like, you know, data collection or per pass, basically, implications of sharing things this way that I think we could never accept as requirements in the IETF. And thirdly, the security model there is not based on, I mean, effectively, the service provider OB draft recommends that we take your credentials, your STIR credentials, be they shaking credentials or whatever, and use those to form TLS connections to these CPSs to authenticate who the parties are that are both provisioning and retrieving these passports from them. And there is a very different model that I think is much more focused on these gateway cases because it's so concerned about these edge providers that aren't necessarily the service providers themselves. And so there's a lot more leeway for just kind of rando people to like inject passports into it. And I think those are bluntly here in the IETF, those will all be showstoppers, like everything I just said would be, right? So this is my attempt to look at this, again, that is descriptive of what I see people doing, especially in the enterprise space for out of band, that isn't like the Big Ten model of, oh my God, there's big CPSs in the sky and nobody trusts anybody. Providers don't trust them. They don't trust providers. And they're evil entities that want to do data collection. Instead, this is focused on getting the call placement service, the CPS model, to be something that's very tightly coupled with carrier operations and to use that to try to mitigate as much of the privacy concern as possible. There's more than I wanted to say about this draft, but next slide. So basically, this is just a maintenance update. I mean, there are customers for this. It's not Addis, I'll put it that way, right? There are other service providers, especially internationally, they're very interested in being able to do this. Places that have a lot of legacy TDM that see tremendous value in it. And, you know, as Addis is kind of North American specific and the IETF is not, I think we're looking at this from that more international perspective here. But I don't know what more I need to do on this, to be honest. I mean, I know that we have one issue, which is because we normatively point to 8816, we would need a downref in IETF last call to incorporate some of its mechanisms. But that procedural thing aside, I see no reason why we don't advance this. And I would like somebody to come forward and say what they think more needs to be said in this than what the draft says already. If not, last call it, ship it, be done. We need it.
Chris went. I agree. I think how these things get implemented in networks is different than what is in the document. So I think all the constructs are there necessary to enable this. And I agree with what you said in terms of the different deployment of this versus what I think NIPCA is doing. So yeah. So I +1 to last call.
This is just a working group last call as soon as the chairs get a chance to do so. So what the chairs are hearing here is that we will working group last call this document as soon as the chairs get around to it.
Real soon now.
That's an easy one.
What's next? Out of band, OCSP.
I think he merged OCSP
Yeah.
and state.
Oh, Allstate can now tell me if I've been in a data breach. That's a new service. I just got that as a notification here. So they're like doing the same kind of data breach management. Nice. Thank you.
So this is one deck for both.
It is,
Okay.
yeah. I mean,
You
let's
sure
just
there
let's.
wasn't a div there?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we're going to do one deck for 2 drafts here. And again, just to give the general introduction to what we're trying to accomplish here. Freshness for stir certs, something we know we want to have. Obviously, stir certs have expiries today. From what I see in the field for Shaken, like a year. Yeah, a lot of them are a year seems to be the expiry. Obviously, we think it would be great if we could get faster expiry and more of our expiry that is focused on a slightly different scope than the Shaken scope. I mean, increasingly, we know now that the OCNs that have been used in issuing certificates for Shaken have started to give way to a few variants that are focused on getting non-carrier entities more tightly associated with the Shaken ecosystem, which I think is great and long time been needed. But really when you get down to TN auth lists is when we start to ask hard questions about freshness. So if you're going to have a TN auth list that contains a bunch of TNs, TN ranges, for example, rather than OCNs, things start to get a little complicated because of the inherent dynamism in number assignment. A carrier might have, this set of numbers this day, but then there might be an acquisition or there might be porting, and there's like all these different things that can kind of complicate anytime we try to nail down exactly what the TNs associated with the cert are. Now, back when we did 8226, we put in big passages about doing telephone numbers by reference rather than by value. So you would be able to put like an AIA into the cert, and there would be a URL there. You could dereference that URL, and you would get the absolutely current list of what the telephone number resources are that are associated with this particular cert. The problem with that, though, you got a lot of telephone numbers. So, if this is like, thousands and thousands of telephone numbers, oh yeah, millions potentially telephone numbers, like, you probably, don't necessarily want to share with relying parties. This is the exact set of telephone numbers, the entirety of my inventory I control. That could become a hunt list for the marketing of your competitors if they can just acquire that from a cert. And these are basically public information. And moreover, it's just cumbersome to maintain. I mean, we'd have to come up with a whole change control system and deltas and ways to make it efficient, especially if the list is very dynamic and depending on like how real time we want it to be. So it seems like there's just a lot of hassle around that. So we started looking at a couple of approaches to mitigate this. OCSP and using very short-lived certificates, potentially certificates on an individual TN basis, were the 2 winners of our beauty contest for this. So we're going to talk a little bit about OCSP today and how we think this can work. Next slide. So there's a choice to make in OCSP, and this is reflected in the 2 drafts that we've issued now. OCSP can either be implemented as a terminating side query, in other words, a verification service when it gets a call signed by a cert, grabs the cert, can look at the OSP URL that's in them. Every cert Neustar issues has a URL in it already that shows our OCSP service where you can go like download this stuff. And query it to say, is the certificate still valid? Now, what we added in the baseline STIR certificates OCSP draft is an extension. And I'm not actually talking about the extension here today. I just realized because, of course, that I'm thinking past that at this point. But what this extension permits is for you to ask as part of an OCSP extension, is this certificate still valid for this particular telephone number? And this particular telephone number is presumably the calling number of something that has shown up in your verification service. It's what is in the orig field. You take that, you ship it off to OCSP and say, is this, as of this second, still within the scope of authority of the certificate? And you just get back a binary yes or no to that. That seemed to mitigate the privacy problems of I'm divulging my entire multi-million number inventory to any relying party, and also just the management of like the size, and it just seemed more efficient, right? So that's the way that the base terminating side query works. But OCSP is also famous for stapling. And stapling allows you on the originating side to add some crypto. And this is used commonly in TLS that will tell you, yes, this CA has preemptively said that that number is already, is in scope, and you will know that when you see this on the terminating side automatically. And there was a lot of discussion about like whether that should be part of the base OCSP draft. We decided ultimately to break it out here. At least I proposed that we have a separate draft Peterson STIR OCSP staple that is going to handle the stapling mechanism in the interest of getting the main OCSP mechanism just out and working, because there are people, as Ben and others here can attest, that are like already writing this into the aspects. And so like we kind of want to get the RFC for this out so that they'll be able to reference it in a timely manner. I will say, given the general approaches, the difference between short-lived certs and doing stapling, they start to look real similar. So much so that like, I would be hard pressed to find a significant technical difference between them. Next slide. So, I mean, this just kind of shows what the main issue is, I guess, with OCSP validation on the terminating side. You pay an RTT. In other words, when a call shows up on the verification service side, the classic way OCSP works is, while I'm validating that cert, I find that OCSP URL in it, I do a dip. I ask it, hey, is this number in scope for this certificate right now or not? I get back a response, yes it is, great, fantastic, check mark, ship it to the user endpoint. That cost is paid, and I think these distinctions are really important. That cost is paid at a time around when alerting starts, right? Like you could start alerting the phone and do this dip and probably get the information pushed to the user that says whether or not this was valid before a user could react to that and look at their device and see what the number and the check mark and so forth on it said. So you pay that cost then, but I think that cost there is a little fungible. Next slide. So yeah, stapling, we think, makes this better. It doesn't make it, it's not perfect, but we think it makes it better. So we have a new draft about it. Our proposal is that we're going to carry the staple in the passport. We looked at alternatives, like the staple could maybe be in an identity staple header that would go with SIP. The reasons I don't want to do that is because what if you're using non-SIP protocols for this? And moreover, if you've got like 3 passports because you've got one shaken identity header and like 2 divs in the same request, like how do I figure out which identity staple correlates to it? You need to like build all that stuff out. So I didn't feel like doing that. But what this implies is that you do need to have the staple in hand when the passport is created. So in other words, either you've pre-cached it, and this is commonly used, as I'm sure Russ could attest in OCSP stapling, like the CA basically will push you, I should say the OCSP service will push you staples periodically for the duration of their own expiry, and then you don't need to query for them at the time that you do this validation. You just like grab one that you know is currently valid and you push it into the passport and you're done. There is a big difference here though.
Minor correction. Like if in the web world, if the web server wants to staple, it queries the CA.
Yeah.
And then when a client comes, it already has that answer. And so it just includes it in the first.
Oh, right. Yeah, because the web server does it,
Right.
and it already goes back during the handshake. That's true. Yes, that's important.
It is.
Because we don't have
Just-
that here. Like
That's
that
right.
RTT
That's
doesn't
why
exist
I'm saying
between.
it's different.
Yeah, a related clarification is that, that it's not the CA, in the current mechanism, the CA doesn't push OCSP stuff to the holder of the certificate. The holder of the certificate has to pull it from the CA periodically, like Russ said.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, it's that the holder of the certificate is the AS in the STIR model, right? As
Correct.
opposed to the server in the web model, which is why, yes, I can see that.
Okay.
But I think it's basically the same thing, right? It's the sense the person who needs this attestation to be available to relying parties is the one who is on the hook to go get this.
Correct.
But this thing where I have remember at the bottom here, this is real significant to this use case. Because our OCSP extension is on a per TN answer basis, if you are going to prefetch or pre-acquire these things, not do this during call setup time, you need to have acquired a staple for every individual TN you could be signing for. And if you have a lot of TNs, if you have 500 million TNs you are signing for, you're going to have a database of 500 million staples you're going to be maintaining that you'll have to be periodically pushed to you. Now, there were days when that used to scare me. That sounds like a lot, and it sounds like maybe it's a lot of network, and there's a lot of storage or whatever. It's probably okay. Probably. And again, the alternative, if you don't want to do that, you can always fetch a staple for the TN during call setup time. Next slide. Where, yeah, I mean, however way we do it, you either pay the cost of having that RTT on the AS side when a call comes in for a number. If you don't have a staple pre-cached already, you pay an RTT then, get the staple, build it into your passport, ship it across the VS, or you get all staples for every potential TN you could sign for, even if you only use 0.001% of those on any given day, right? You get all those staples pushed to you to the AS in advance, then you always have them on hand, no call setup time impacts, you're not paying any RTTs. Chris?
Is it a good time to make a
Yeah,
comment?
sure. Let me get some more water though. Jeez.
Okay. So I think, and I've sort of talked to John a little bit about this. I think the way certificate authorities have been implemented, they're generally very closely associated with the authentication solutions. I think we should be very progressive here and not have a fragmented set of solutions and just go right to staples, per TN staples. I think it's good to bring up all the caveats and all those things, but I think, getting to the point where even in real time, you're creating certificates for calls is not unrealistic. Yeah, exactly.
Use the mic, please.
Yeah, I'd like
The
to remind
note
people,
taker's remote.
yes, I'd like to remind people to use the Q and the mic, and I thank Richard for actually using the Q for the next spot.
I'm having trouble getting
By
it
the way,
working.
Barnes, you're missing out this week on some fine dining. You really need to change your philosophy in life. Anyway, good to see you, man.
I've made my peace with never going to a restaurant again. So you cannot tempt me. I was going to vocalize here what I put in the chat, which is that even if you don't do all this prefetching and you have the AS do an RTT over to do an OCSP fetch at call time, like you're still getting a privacy benefit in that case. So OCSP sucks for two reasons. Like one is the RTT, and two is that it reveals who's calling
No,
whom.
totally agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want
We
to
had that
point
on
that
the
out in case
slide.
folks thought your reminder about caching everything was intimidating. It might be a reason not to do this. It's like there's still reasons to do this.
No, I agreed. I mean, and we do have that on one of the slides somewhere where we mentioned that privacy exposure is actually one of the major reasons to do this.
Yeah, cool.
All right, Jonathan Rosenberg 59. So I'll just restate what I sat sitting down is practically speaking, as you know, most of the time the AS on the originating side is making an HTTP query to some third-party vendor whose name begins with an N or something like that, and they return the signed passport. I mean, you're already paying the RTT to get the passport on the AS side, so getting the stable cert doesn't seem like it's not actually going to add an additional round trip unless I'm missing something, right?
I mean, if your AS vendor happened also to be your CA, geez, I wonder if there are any companies
Right, that's
that
what I'm
can
saying.
do that.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, suddenly that doesn't seem so bad.
No,
does
that's
it?
what I'm saying. So practically
Yes.
speaking, that probably doesn't matter, whereas it's not true on the other side. So it seems like putting on
Yes,
Collusion.
the other thing I was going to say, this is an out of left field comment, so take it as it is. Like, I wasn't involved in the discussion. Did you guys look at like a Bloom filter as an alternative way to do this?
Ecker and I actually were just talking about that last night. So I've asked Ecker to do a full review of this. And yeah, he thinks there is a Bloom filter way to do this. Well, we're going to have to see how
Okay.
practically that's going to work. But
Yeah.
I did enlist him on this over pizza last night.
Okay.
That would have been a fun conversation.
Yeah, well, he can't be here. He has more important places to be than hang out in STIR.
Well, so's our co-chair.
So I was just going to reinforce what was just said. And, like, since we're querying anyways, that reduces the privacy thing. We need to analyze it, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I don't see that as much of a problem.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I didn't make the same argument about service provider OSP, OOB, but really you can, right? Like, I mean, if the AS function for this is already a cloud function that, effectively, RCPS is like adjacent to our AS, and like actually us sending a passport back is the same instance as us putting it in our CPS. So like,
So-
it's,
Our slides just went away. You still have more slides, though, right? You need them back up.
do I?
I don't know. They went away. I'll look.
I mean, I think we're pretty much to it, right? I mean, I think people get what the trade-off is. I'm sure that my next slides are just questions about, hey, what do you think?
Is this where we were?
We went past
were there.
this, past, I think we got to here, yeah.
Okay.
So like, there's stuff that we still need to do, right? If we're going to flesh this out and make it work. For stapling, I mean, for example, you're going to have all your divs stapled, right? If you want this to work as intended. And like, so I'm going to have to write a bunch of stuff about that. I don't think the interactions look complicated, but like, it's just got to be done. There's been some talk over on the ATA side, and I do distantly hear this chatter, like, through various spies and emissaries, about what the interaction and coexistence of this is with CRLs. I mean, I think my intuition about this is that it's orthogonal, in the sense of CRLs exist in the way that the STI PA has operated, and the way the STI CAs under its governance operate. So I don't think they're going to go away as a result of anything that we're doing here. I do just always want to seize on this one small point, which is that getting back an OCSP response because of our extension that says merely this telephone number is not in scope for this, so you get back a no, that does not mean the cert is revoked. Right? And like, so I keep shouting this at, the people at ATIS that I talk to. Be really careful about the way that you talk about this, because merely getting back like a negative OCSP response for a particular TN not mean the cert is revoked.
I think I've seen Alec mirror that comment.
Well, I've been shouting it at him among other people, so.
Yeah, and I think I was asking those questions as well, because Chris went. Just clarifying, is the intent of the draft to only be about querying telephone numbers versus revocation, or do we need both mechanisms? And I think we should be clear about that.
I mean, to me, this is an attempt to replace TN by value, or TN by
Right.
reference in 8226 with something that behaves in a way that is much more lightweight, doesn't have all those state management, deltaing, and everything else problems, and doesn't have the privacy revealing problems. Like that's the job. And if it tells you anything about certificate livelihood, that's just like gravy.
I have a separate comment, but I didn't want to, if anybody else has comments on that one.
This is Russ. I just want to make sure I understood that last comment. If you get a no, it doesn't mean it's revoked. It means not this phone number, not right now.
Yes.
But if you get a yes, it means yes, the certificate's good and it's good for this phone number.
Right now.
Yes.
Okay.
It does not mean it's good for any other telephone number. But yes.
Correct.
But at least the certificate is not expired or compromised. Yes.
Right.
My other comment was just to sort of say what I said before, probably prematurely, but another plea to maybe simplify things and just talk about stapling with OCSP as the only option.
As the only option.
As the only option.
Well, I mean, so that would be an argument to recombine the drafts, right?
I'm
To not have
worried
this be a
about-
separate draft.
I'm worried about fragmentation and people getting confused and all the good stuff that we talk about. I think this really is the end state that we should be at.
Man, any more thoughts in the room about that?
So Jackson Street.
Are we
Accused building.
so Jack, are we worried about like normal OCSP not actually solving the like TN by ref privacy issue? Because you could just go through and enumerate all of the phone numbers, which, while there are a lot of phone numbers, probably wouldn't be too hard because you probably have quite a good idea of roughly what number they have.
So you mean trial and error? I just try every phone number and see like if it's in the scope of a particular cert.
Yeah, just try all of them.
Yeah, I mean, I worry about that. I mean, there are mitigations for that I think we could probably implement, but I mean, so I'm on the fence about this, to be blunt. I mean, I think having something that works as close to traditional OCSP works is probably valid in the sense that, you know, like I said, we ship an OCSP URL in like every shaken cert that we issue today, right? And like we have infrastructure that supports it. I mean, I could be persuaded though that really the risks are too severe. Does it actually mitigate the risk though to push it to the AS side? In the sense of like, there's still an OCSP service. You can still hit it with these queries. I mean, unless there's an allow list for what the set of ASs are that are allowed to acquire staples.
Yeah, you could
Is that
just not
common?
have that remote OCSP service. Like, there's nothing requiring you to have that remote OCSP service if everything's stapled.
Just quickly, I really fear the verification service side complaints and things. I think we're going to go down in a rat hole on that whole thing.
Well, are people basically, so let's go through this operationally. Are people cool with the passport size increase that staple entails? Because this, you know, we're adding a new staple element. It's going to be a base 64 encoded element, I assume, that's going to be in the passport. Who here would know what the rough size estimate is that that's adding to a passport? Like how big is a staple, Russ? Because I mean, I know I looked at a couple of breakdowns of staples, but they were ones that had already been decoded, right? And
Yeah.
like listed all the stuff that's in it. They're not small though, right?
They're not huge either.
Yeah, they're not huge. But I'm just making sure.
RCD is bigger.
Yeah.
Before
Yeah,
we dive-
RCD is bigger than a lot of things are.
Before we dive too far in that, we also have 3 people still in queue.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm sorry, Subir.
And we have 3 minutes.
Subir Das. John, I just want to know your thoughts about the scenario because you mentioned that TN, part TN, right? For the OSP, right? That part TN verification. So if that telephone number is not the real telephone number, and then there is something, right, which translates, how that use case will be covered?
I'm not sure I followed.
For example, right, that I use a different telephone number, right, where the call terminates, right? But what it shows that to outside that, okay, that is the telephone number. That's not exactly the telephone number, which translates to a new number. So is it that expectation that the verification service will have that translation and then that cert will be issued with that number or the original number? What is?
I'm sorry. I'm still not following you.
Like portability cases?
Portability cases,
Yes,
you mean?
yes. Yeah,
I mean, I think that is orthogonal to this. I think it should work either way, as far as I understand what you're asking.
Yeah. So I was just trying to understand that if it is tied to a telephone number, right? And if that is not exactly the telephone number, but the call is terminating, how that scenario will be covered?
But I mean, the point is, yeah. I mean, so you're asking if when it's stapled. Well, again, all you're looking at when it's stapled is the original telephone number, not the DAST, right? And so it's orthogonal because the orig never changes. The DAST can change because of portability or translations or forwarding or like a whole host of things like that. But if the orig ever changes, you've got a new call in your hands, right? That needs a new password.
Real quick, we have a 2-minute warning. If
Okay.
any of the conversations are complicated, please take them to the list. Let's see if we can work the queue real fast.
Okay.
Am I next?
Yes.
Jonathan Rosenberg, 5'9". I think less is more. The AS side thing seems better. Just do that as the only option.
Okay.
Jonathan is the last one.
That was right. We had Richard, but he jumped.
All right. So
Okay.
just real quick in the room. So should I recombine these drafts and just put staple then back into OCSP? If that's the only thing we're going to do, let's not do this as separate drafts.
Does anyone object to that way forward? Okay,
Jackson Q.
Jack?
this is I'm not happy about the fact I'm making this point, but if you just have OCSP stapling and not OCSP, that begins to look a lot like short-lived certs all over again.
Yeah, so we say this a lot, right? We have it in the slide. I think the difference is so minimal, I don't even know how to characterize it or make technical decisions between them. What's the point? So, I mean, the difference is you're either, all right, we'll take our last minute to discuss this. So, I mean, either the CA, right, actually synthesizes a single TN cert for like every TN is possible for this particular customer to sign for and pushes them, or you query for them as needed and sign with them. These have an expiry of 90 seconds, these certs do, and then they're gone. That is identical to stapling. The work cryptographically of creating that cert and then pushing it to the AS and having the AS execute the signature over the passport with it, computationally, it might be 1.5 times X what it costs to generate a staple. From a validation perspective, it might, again, like on the terminating
No.
side, you save it though.
I don't think that's right, because if it depends whether he's generating a new key for each cert, or he's getting a rekey.
So if you're sending a CSR
Correct.
with each thing up to get your short-lived cert,
Then you got
and
two signs.
you have an Acme-like thing that's doing it. But you save it on the terminating side, because the terminating side doesn't have to validate both the signature on the passport
Correct.
and the staple.
That's right.
So again, there is a trade-off, but but these are computational trade-offs. These are not
Yes.
network trade-offs. These are not differences in RTTs that are caused post-out delay. These are marginal computational differences.
All right, we are out of time, so we very much need to continue this discussion on the list about short-lived certs versus OCSP.
Well, and we can wrap that short-lived draft. Somebody else read it. Somebody tell me what you think, right? Like, I mean, it could be that that's really the answer. If I felt more like Acme had been adopted more for issuing certs overall, I'd feel much more comfortable about short-lived, because Acme has Acme Star. They have like whole systems that are designed just for this delivery. The fact that we have not seen that much uptake of the Acme protocol makes me a little nervous about doing short-lived certs, and this is probably better.
Short-lived certs has terminating side transaction. I think that's.
Murray, did you want to say something?
Even with short-lived certs, you still need to query on the terminating side to get the certificate.
Murray, did you have any words of wisdom for us?
Nope, you got all the wisdom.
So thanks everyone for joining today. We'll see you next time. Thanks very much to Jack for taking notes. I apologize for forgetting to say that at the beginning of the meeting.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
We've managed to always use all the time. We've managed to always use all the time.
Yes. I think we had the right amount of time today.
Yeah.
Chair Smith, your mic is still hot.
I'm trying to think of something horribly offensive to say, but it's not coming to mind.